Yeah, welcome to everybody that's joining today. I'm going to be talking to you about speech language communication needs, and I know that a lot of you work across all the different key stages. So I'm going to talk about across the different because I do know that sometimes those secondary and the transitions are ignored a little bit. So I want to make sure that we are covering those as well. So just to introduce myself, so I am a speech and language therapy lecturer. I qualified as a speech and language therapist over 20 years, over 20, well, 25 years ago now, and have worked in community clinics, sure starts, telehealth and private practice, but I've spent most of my career in primary and secondary schools and specialists, mainstream schools across the different key stages. 15 years, I worked in a Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 speech and language centre for speech sound disorder and developmental language disorder. Um, and I also worked in transition to secondary school at that point. I led on that. And then from 2021, I have been a lecturer teaching new speech and language therapists at Birmingham City University and now at Keele University. My main areas are phonetics, speech sound disorders, developmental language disorder, and I do a little bit of research as well. I'm currently writing a book for speech and language therapists on speech sound disorders, on the working with children with speech sound disorders. I also was one of the supporting authors of our national clinical guidance for speech sound disorders. You may have said that at the bottom because to show that I've got kids at home and a husband. So if you hear noises, it is my kids. So I've got a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old in the house. So that's always fun. We'll see how that goes tonight. But hopefully you won't hear them. They're under strict instructions. Okay, I don't know what that line that's come down there, Carla, is. That's weird, isn't it? Can everybody see that? I don't know where that's come from. Anyway, I'll carry on. Okay, so the main thing that I'm going to cover today is why speech language communication needs. Why is it really important to consider them across the key stages and in all these different specialists and special settings? And then think about the different types of speech language communication needs you're probably going to be coming across within your settings as well. And the main thing is to consider the types of ways that you can help them and to how you can look out for those different types of difficulties as well. So that's what I want to get you across today. I want you to leave today with some really useful resources that you can access and practical ways that you can help these children as well. So that's what I'm hoping for. The presentation itself is probably going to take about an hour, and then there should be plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So we're hoping to have like 25 minutes or so at the end for questions. So if you haven't got any burning questions, just write them in the chat for us. That'd be really helpful. And then I'll come away from my this screen sharing and we'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end. That will be amazing. So the first thing is why speech language communication needs matter. In my opinion, it's obviously really important, but I'm very biased. So I'm still going to try and convince you that they are really important. Speech language communication needs are the most common type of SEN in schools. That's around the world and in the UK. So around 10% of all children in our country have long-term speech language and communication needs. When it comes to specialist settings and special settings, that number obviously increases exponentially. You're going to have a lot of children in your and young people in your settings that have speech language communication needs. Often, difficulties in these areas are often hidden, they're misinterpreted as behaviour or low motivation. There might be those quiet kids in the classroom that maybe don't get noticed. So we need to really think about how we can spot these kind of kids. It's also really important that because language learning and language abilities really underpin so many different aspects of education and social skills. So they underpin literacy, as you can imagine. A lot of learning around vocab, and I'll talk through that and why that's really important. Social development, so peer interactions, adult interactions, and well-being and mental health. So there is a huge amount of evidence to say that if we don't support children with speech, language, and communication needs, it really does have an impact on their outcomes later in life. So it has huge implications for educational outcomes, so GCSEs, SATs, all of that kind of stuff. But even more importantly, that then goes on to have an impact on employment. There is some research I'm going to go through with you around how speech language communication needs really are very, very prevalent in the criminal justice settings, in seeing a typo, mental health, not mental health, and homelessness. So that's why I think it's really important that we consider it. So in schools, as I said, around 10% of all children have speech language communication needs. That's from our local body. That's our national body, the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, who did that research in 2021. If anything, the new research that's coming out over the last couple of years means that that's potentially increasing a little bit more. So it's at least 10% of children. The main categories with those percentages are in these areas. So I know that you do specific training, and I think there's a load of awareness, which is fantastic, on autism, for example. But look at those numbers. We're looking at around 1 to 2% of children across the board with autism or social communication needs. Obviously, in your settings, potentially that's going to be a much bigger prevalence. But if you look at those other categories, we've got something called developmental language disorder that I'm going to go through, which is around 7% of all children. Speech sound disorder, around 3 to 5% of 4 to 6-year-olds, and that kind of goes down a little bit as they get older. And then we've got stammering, so dysfluency, around 1%. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts about this, because I have asked Carla about kind of who's coming today, what kind of settings you're working in, but it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. So what are your thoughts? Are you surprised at those numbers? Do you feel it reflects your class, your school that you're working in, or do you feel that you have more, you have less? What are your thoughts about that? I'm going to have a look at the chat. Lovely. Okay, I'm going to wait for people to put that in to have a little bit of a chance to kind of think about those numbers. I mean, the specialist centre that I worked in, all of them had speech language communication needs, but I have worked in mainstream schools, and I've also worked in different areas around the country. So I have worked, for example, in the middle of Birmingham, and in lots of different types of kind of more social deprived areas. And I would say that the percentages are a lot higher there, obviously. Oh, this is fantastic. So Alexi, ASC specialist school says higher, yeah. All have some types. I thought this probably would be the case, 100%, yeah. I would probably say that that's accurate, yes. Village school, and we are seeing more children struggling. That's really interesting. And I think that's a national picture, actually. Um, I think it was already increasing, those children with speech language communication needs. The pandemic certainly widened that gap in different areas. So with children arriving back into schools when they'd had quite a bit of time off, the gap between the children who had good language and the children who maybe didn't was wider, which is really interesting. I'm not in education yet, worked in social care. Yes, that's really interesting. And a lot of speech language communication needs there. Most of our children in the SEN school are non-verbal entirely. Okay, overlap is very common, and the number goes up, especially, yeah, agreed with you, Ethan, really, in those economically deprived communities. Yeah, seeing an increase. I think it's really timely, this, that you've got me to, got some speech language communication need training in. I do think this is kind of coming out, especially with the government new strategy for education as well. Oracy and speech language communication is prevalent within that. So I think there's going to be a bit of a push on getting speech language communication support for children. The guy who looked after us and the SLCN team did get really quiet with his speech. Oh, that's really sweet. When he was tired, it's a lot of effort. When you're tired, if you've got speech language communication difficulties when you are tired, that's probably the first thing that goes. It's just so much effort. It just takes a lot of brain space. Um, and it would just, yeah, it would bring that out. It's really good that you noticed that, Tony, actually. Really intuitive of you. Okay, I'm going to come out of that so I can actually see what I'm talking about. So, okay, so as I said, impact on literacy, learning, and life outcomes. I just wanted to go through this with you because there are some quite stark percentages. So the analysis of data for the Department of Education indicated that only around 20% of children with speech language communication needs achieve those expected levels in reading, writing, and maths at the end of primary school, compared with 74% of other children with no identified SEN. So that's a huge gap, isn't there? There. This is the biggest one, I think, and this is really interesting. So poor vocabulary at age 5 is the biggest indicator of outcomes. And it's the biggest indicator of outcomes linked to reading and maths at SATs and maths GCSE, English GCSE. And actually the gap was wider in maths than it was in English, which is quite, I think on the face of it feels quite surprising. But then if you think about in maths, as you get further and further up the curriculum, how many concepts and abstract language is used within maths. And if children are struggling with their language skills, that's really going to have an impact on their math skills as well. So that was the biggest indicator. Vocab at 5 is the biggest indicator of outcomes at GCSE level. Really interesting, I think. Children with poor early language are twice as likely to be unemployed at 34, so they've got that extension of those life outcomes. 45% of young people referred to mental health services have communication difficulties, and 60% plus, this is a huge one, 60%, more than 60% of young offenders have speech language communication needs. Now go back to what we said about the prevalence overall. We're talking 10% of people have speech language communication needs, but over half of young offenders have speech language communication needs. That is a huge difference, a huge gap, isn't there? So it's something that we can do about it. There was a really important study actually by Maxine Winstanley, who also works with me at Keele, who's absolutely incredible. And she looked at those type of children who had speech language communication needs and saw those outcomes if they got support, and saw that actually if they had support from a young age, then there was no greater outcome risk of being a young offender. It's those that aren't identified and not supported that have that huge discrepancy in their outcomes. So I'm going to go through developmental language disorder. Obviously, I mentioned that at the start. It was the one that had like the 7% of prevalence across the board. I am sure, in your specialist centres, even your autism centres as well, will have children with language disorder. How it works is, with this diagnosis, if you don't have a comorbid condition such as autism, you tend to get a diagnosis of developmental language disorder if you have specific language difficulties. If you have a diagnosis of autism, it tends to be language disorder associated with autism. So it's like seen as an additional thing that children can have on top of autism. So what this means is persistent difficulties with understanding or using spoken language, or both. So, and usually it's both. So if a child struggles to understand sentences, conversations, vocabulary, they're probably then going to struggle and really find it hard to then use vocabulary, put sentences together, which makes sense, doesn't it? It used to be called specific language impairment, or SLI. Around kind of 10 years ago, there was a big push to kind of bring everything together and use this new terminology, developmental language disorder, and incorporated more children as well that maybe were not included in specific language impairment because they had learning disability. We now include those children with learning disability with developmental language disorder as well. You can have it if you have a learning disability. It impacts, as I say, around 7% of children. That's around 2 in every classroom in a mainstream school. In your classrooms, a lot more, I would say. It is a lifelong condition. It may change through time and develop, and there's obviously new challenges that come along in language as you get older, but it won't disappear. It often co-occurs with autism, with ADHD, massively with dyslexia, and with speech sound disorder, which I'm going to talk about later. Raddled is one of the main websites, and I've got that into the resources at the end that I'll go through with you. Okay, this is what it covers, developmental language disorder. I love this infographic. And this is freely available on that Raddled website. So the main things that children with developmental language disorder really struggle with are, I would say, in this area here. You've got words, sentences, and discourse. What discourse basically means is those pragmatic areas, those social skills of language. Those conversations that they're going to be having. So for words, children are potentially going to have a smaller vocabulary, find it really hard to pick up vocabulary when they're younger, using non-specific words such as it and that and those when they can't find the words, those word finding difficulties, so trouble recalling words, that tip of the tongue feeling that we all get when we are struggling to think of that word, maybe when we are a little bit tired. Children with developmental language disorder that I've worked with, a lot of them really talk about that they have that constantly. Imagine how frustrating that must be for them. They have trouble understanding and learning words, especially words that have multiple meanings, those abstract words, maybe the non-nouns that aren't really, you can't picture them quite as much. But then definitely in this sentences kind of area, difficulties ordering words. So children at the young ages might really struggle to put words together. They might have lots and lots of words, but they find it really hard to string a sentence together. They might miss parts of words out. They might miss those kind of little words that mean a lot within sentences as well. They might struggle here with difficulty reading between the lines, find it hard to follow stories. They're out of sequence, that kind of thing. They found sequencing stories really difficult. And then you're getting on to the slightly more kind of going into other realms. So difficulty in different situations, having conversations, missing social cues. There is huge overlap here with autism, massive overlap with autism, which is why there is often a lot of talk about that differential diagnosis between the two. Often children have both. So if you're having difficulties, if the child you're thinking about is having difficulties ordering words together, recalling words, using non-specific words, that usually isn't part of autism. That isn't a diagnostic criteria for autism. You're going more into the language realm here, whereas obviously missing social cues, difficulty having conversations, different situations, that kind of thing, potentially might lead you more into the autism side of it. But there is huge overlap there. Learning and memory is really a part of it as well, and these speech sound areas, which I'm going to talk about a little bit with speech sound disorder as well, but there is a bit of an overlap. I would say the main things to consider here for developmental language disorder are the words, sentences, and discourse. They are your key things to really think about with some of these children that you are working with and why they might be struggling to form sentences, think of words, understand what you've said to them. Okay. There are in the resources I put you loads of bits on this, by the way, of what you can actually do to help as well. But this is what impact it can have, as you can imagine. Children with DLD or developmental language disorder and young people, it really impacts with their vocabulary, their reading comprehension. If they're not able to understand verbal sentences, they're going to struggle to understand reading, because the underlying difficulty isn't about memory often, it's about actually understanding those sentences as a whole, not understanding the words in it, understanding the syntax of the sentences. So they're still going to struggle with reading as well. They're obviously going to find it really difficult to write sentences, to write stories. They're going to find it difficult to have that social interaction with peers and build relationships. So as we said, Winstanley, that's Maxine Winstanley in 2021, highlighted that early identification and school-based interventions, so not even kind of, this is sometimes from us, sometimes from what you're doing at school, often led by a speech and language therapist, they can improve language and long-term outcomes. If you can do that work in the schools, it makes a huge difference for these children. It doesn't have to be that they follow that pipeline from school to criminal justice. You can make a difference. So these are the key bits. I put in some key bits that were really, really helpful. And then at the end, when we've gone through all the different conditions we are considering, we've got those resources. Most of them are for free that I've given you access, that you can have access to. So the best practice is explicit teaching of key vocab, because I spoke about how important vocabulary was at 5. If they're struggling with their vocab and they have a low vocabulary, they're finding it hard to learn new words, then they're going to have those difficulties in their outcomes. So let's just hit there first. There's some incredible stuff. You're probably aware of Vocabulary Ninja, but he's all for a lot of it's for free that you can download. What you're if you're working on a particular subject in your curriculum, you can go on there. If it's in the national curriculum, usually Vocabulary Ninja has done a vocab pack for that curriculum subject. So it tells you exactly what vocab you're going to be teaching. There's also some really good stuff by Word Aware, called Words Aware, that's by Stephen Parsons and Anna Brannigan, who are speech and language therapists. They do training for schools. They do, there are some really good books out there. They are a little bit of a cost, but they're not expensive stuff. Visuals are really important for these children because often auditory stuff is very, very difficult. So grouping words together using things like colourful semantics that are freely available on Twinkle and things like that are fantastic. And if they're finding putting sentences together and putting in adverbs and adjectives and all those really useful words that we use to make our language exciting, things like shape coding is really helpful. They help with things like past tenses and plurals and all of those kind of things. Demonstrations of expectations rather than telling them verbally. So I am going to ask you to do this, and do this, and you get that blank look. Actually demonstrating what you're asking those children to do is much more useful for children with language disorders. Repetition, repetition, repetition. As you know, say it again the same way. Because sometimes what we think we're doing is, right, I'm going to say it in a different way. It might confuse them. Because they might be processing what you've said and they just need it repeating to kind of fill in some gaps. And then you say it completely differently, and then that'll completely throw them. So actually repeating what you said, as long as it's, in a nice, clear way, can be the best thing to do. Having functional communication goals, so that those goals that we're setting for children aren't around being polite and things like that, actually functional. Can they get their needs known? Can they communicate with their peers? Those really important stuff. That's what we should be setting as communication goals. A lot of children who have these difficulties with language often find it really difficult to pick out language when there's a lot of background noise going on. So if you can, when you're giving instructions, try to reduce that background noise when you are speaking, making sure that they are looking at you when you're speaking, if they find that comfortable. Never say, look at me, if they're finding that obviously very difficult because they find that they're, neurodiverse. I would never encourage that. And then consider your level of questioning. There is something I've put in that, so I think if you're going to do anything for children with language disorder, the two things are your vocab and blanks levels. Blanks levels are really useful levels of questioning that we are asking children, and that is based on a level of abstractness. So blanks level 1, for example, is what's this, with something visual, and then you go on to blanks level 2 is tell me a bit more about this. So it's red, it's green, it's large, that kind of thing. Blanks level 3 is around putting stories together. So what happened in that story. And blanks level 4 is around why and how. And what you can do, you can map children onto those different blanks levels, and then you know what types of questions they are going to be able to answer sufficiently. Children who have language disorder often are at those kind of lower levels of blanks levels, and so you need to really consider when you're asking questions, what kind of questions you're going to be asking them, especially if we're thinking about those children who potentially have language disorder and it is impacting on their behaviour. So if they are finding it really hard to make themselves heard, and then something's happened on the playground, they've got frustrated, and then you ask them, why did you do that? Straight away, they can't answer that question. So the next thing to do is, right, break it down, ask the right level of questions for them, or wait until they're ready. Sometimes they're not ready, but it's that kind of thing. And I've put you some really good stuff that you can help at the end on that. Lovely. This is what I did, just to show you that we are just getting to grips with this as well. I did some research on adults missing that DLD boat. The DLD stuff has only been in the last 10 years, but there are adults. It's a lifelong condition. There are adults who did not get a good service at school, and so they completely missed the boat on that DLD diagnosis and support. So I'm trying to push kind of to get those older children and into colleges and universities to get that support in there for them. And I did a lot of research on talking to speech and language therapists and making sure that they're still getting support. So there was a lot of work on this area, but just to show you that, we're all being quite active to try and get that known across. Right, doing all right for time. We're doing okay. So speech sound disorder is a persistent difficulty with producing speech sounds. So this is the kids who have unclear speech. And I think if you don't know anything about speech and language therapy, that's probably who you think we work with. It's those kids who struggle with their speech sounds in particular. So they might say, instead of saying cat, they'd say tat. Instead of saying dog, they'd say gog, that kind of thing. So this is called speech sound disorder. There are different types of speech sound disorder, but it really impacts intelligibility, their confidence levels, and weirdly, their literacy, because the same underlying difficulties that children with speech sound disorder have often mean that they have dyslexia. Because if they're not able to pick out what sounds are in language and not able to say the right sounds, they're not going to be able to spell them. Consider how we're going to spell. So when I spell a really tricky word, even now, I sound it out, don't I? And we encourage children to sound out words. If they're saying them incorrectly, they're always going to spell them incorrectly. And because of that difficulties with kind of organising their sounds in their head, it often means that it can link into developmental language disorder, because if they can't pick out the sounds in words, then they can't pick out the words in sentences, which means that they will go on to have difficulties understanding language. So there's a huge comorbidity for speech sound disorder and developmental language disorder. And basically the centre that I worked in for 15 or so years, with children with speech sound disorder and developmental language disorder, often both. So the subtypes of speech sound disorder are the articulation disorder. That's that physical production difficulty. Can they not actually say those sounds? Things like cleft lip and palate. Things like that, they just have a difficulty with their articulation. That's that physical production issue. That is not many kids with speech sound disorder. The vast majority have a speech sound disorder because they have a real issue organising the sounds in their brain. It's nothing to do with the fact that they aren't able to say the sounds. They can physically say the sounds. It's just that they haven't worked out the difference between a t and a k, for example. So they just use t all the time. They haven't worked out that when they say school at the beginning, sk, there's a sk, and they just say, oh, I can't, they just can't pick out that there's two sounds. So they say, I'm going to call. They can, but if you say to them, say school, they can do it. It's just that they haven't mapped that in their brain, and that's what they're not saying. So it isn't actually to do with articulation, it's to do with a phonological delay or disorder. That is around 75% of speech sound disorder referrals into SLT that have a phonological delay and disorder if they have a speech sound disorder. Then there's inconsistent phonological disorder, which is really easy to spot, actually. Those are the kids that when they say a word, every time they say the word umbrella, or every time they say their mate's name, they say it completely differently. So it's completely inconsistent. They haven't got those patterns at all. So they might say Banzella, Manella, Badella, So you have no idea what they're going to say every time. There's loads of those kids. That's around 10% of the kids who come into speech therapy for speech sound disorder. As you can imagine, those are the children who have massive difficulties with intelligibility. Really difficult to understand what they're saying, but there is some really good therapy for those children. Then we do have those childhood apraxia of speech children, so there's motor program difficulties. So CASC, childhood apraxia of speech, used to be called developmental verbal dyspraxia, if you've heard of that. So childhood apraxia of speech and dysarthria. That is much more to do with that motor planning and production difficulties, but they are a little bit more rare. In your centres and in your settings, there might be quite a few of these children though. Often children with dysarthric tendencies, and dysarthria are those children who have cerebral palsy, might have Down syndrome, because that's obviously impacted that their underlying conditions impacts on their muscles and muscle weakness. So that would have a impact obviously on their speech. So that is dysarthria. This is a really helpful thing, and I've linked to where you can get this from. This is completely free. I think this is really helpful for those of you who are working in the early years and kind of into that key stage 1 areas. So this is with an incredibly huge study by McLeod and Crow in 2018, and they looked at how children learn new sounds. So which sounds do children have at different ages? So this really helps them with referral to speech therapy, because you know when it isn't actually typical. So what they're saying is, you can see at the bottom, the average age of acquisition of English contents across the world, 90 to 100% criteria. What that 90 to 100% criteria means, and that's really important, is that 90%, at least 90% of 4-year-olds, for example, can say v, z, s, sh, ch, j, and la. 90%. So if you're not saying them at 4, you are in that bottom 10% at least. And what this actually found was that we were seeing children a little bit too late in speech therapy. This opened up a bit of a can of worms in speech therapy, because it meant that that wait and see approach that often speech therapists say, no, they're fine, just carry on, do what you're doing, they'll be fine, they'll catch up, meant that this kind of told them that they were a little bit further behind than we originally thought. So they should be seen earlier. So what we're saying is here is that by 6, all children, so 90% of children at least, should be saying every single sound, every single phoneme they should be using correctly. So they should have adult speech, adult-like speech, apart from potentially for those really tricky words, the ones that got those multi-syllables and those new words, but they should have all of these really difficult voiceless th and voiced the j sound, the r sound should come at 5, which I think threw everybody. Those l's and all of those kind of sounds as well. They should be coming at 6. So if they aren't using all of those sounds at that age, they are behind, and they should be seen by a speech therapist, because as we know, it then impacts on their literacy. So what we need to do is we need to model sounds naturally. So they need to hear. There's loads of evidence to say that if they have a difficulty, for example, with a k sound, just getting them to listen to lots and lots of words with a k sound in them has a huge impact. So we talk to parents of all age children, and we are talking about children, older children with learning disability here. This has been done on kind of 10, 11, 12-year-olds who are still struggling with those different sounds, and doing some play therapy. You would work on those k sounds, not by asking them to say them, but just getting down on the child's level and using loads and loads of words with that k sound in. So you might get a bag, a feely bag with loads of k objects in, and they just get to play with them and hear them over and over again, and get them to the parent or whoever's working with them to model those sounds for them and those words. Avoid overcorrection, because you don't want them to feel really conscious of their speech. Oh no, that was wrong, that was wrong, that was wrong. You don't want them to do that at all, but just model it back. So if they said it's a ting rather than a king, you would say, yes, well done. Oh, the thing in the castle, that is a king. So they're hearing it in the correct way. Getting down on the child level is really important so they can see your face. Encourage listening and repetition. Can you say this back? That kind of thing. Liaise with the speech and language therapist for assessment to see which one of those areas, so is it an articulation difficulty, is it a phonological difficulty, or is it something a little bit more persistent like that childhood apraxia of speech or dysarthria, and then that will really make an impact on what types of therapy and intervention you're going to be doing with them or maybe helping out with. There's a really useful thing that happened very quickly. As soon as that year 1 phonics test came out, there was a bit of an outcry from speech therapists to say, well, what about if they have speech sound disorder? So if they're doing a phonics test and they're reading that non-word of, I don't know, boos, there's a good one. So boos, but they can't say a sound, and they say boot for boos, that we need to make sure that we're not marking that wrong, because that's just how they say it. They might have actually read it beautifully, but they said it incorrectly because that's just how they say it. So there is some guidance out there on how you would do the year 1 phonics test with children with speech sound disorder. This is a biggie again. So you know how I had word aware and blanks levels for DLD? This is my thing for speech sound disorder that you can really make a difference with for these children, and it's perfect for all ages. It's absolutely fantastic. So working on those underlying phonological awareness skills is one of the only things I think we can ever say works with every child every time. It's got the biggest amount, the most consistent evidence base that it makes a huge difference for children. This Newcastle assessment of phonological awareness and the Newcastle intervention for phonological awareness, I'm going to show you in a little while, is from the University of Newcastle, and it is completely free, and it is a screening tool that you can use across a class. And it's got some really lovely, and it's got exactly how you do it with videos and everything else. And then not only has it got an assessment, then it tells you that if they're struggling with, I don't know, syllable awareness, that's where they've stopped that child or those group of children, then this is what you do and the intervention. And it's got an intervention of how you actually work on it as well. And it is meant for schools. It's absolutely fantastic. I cannot recommend it highly enough. So I'll show you the link for that later. Okay. Yeah, we're doing all right. This is fine. Doing fine for time. I feel like I'm talking very fast. I'm very sorry, everybody. So stammering or disfluency. This is known as stuttering in the USA. I think people are using interchangeably now, just to show that it does actually mean the same thing. So at least 1% of adults stammer or have some type of disfluency, and around 8% of children do. So that kind of shows that a lot of those children, the vast majority of children who are stammering when they're younger, often it just fades away, or they have some therapy, but often it's a developmental disfluency, which means that it kind of, as their language levels increase and they get more ability to process language and to plan language and put language together in longer and longer sentences, that it tends to go. But a lot of children tend to get that developmental disfluency when they have an explosion of language. You know, those kids who are like 3 or 4, or maybe a little bit older in some children with learning disability, when they have that explosion of language, all of a sudden they've got loads of new words, they're putting loads of sentences together, they want to tell you everything, that kind of social explosion. And they come out of school and they want to talk to you about something, or they've had an amazing weekend, they come in on a Monday and they want to talk to you about something. Sometimes at that point, that's when they start to stammer, because they've just not quite ready. The brain development is moving ahead of what's going on with their mouth and their lips and their coordination. So they just can't get it out. So they tend to stumble over their words. And that might be things like they might repeat. So instead of saying mummy, they might say mummy, mummy, that kind of thing. They might prolong a sound. So instead of saying mummy, they'll say mummy. That's a stammer as well. Or they might get completely blocked. So on the word mummy, they would say mummy. So it would be like a sound that wouldn't come out. The most prevalent and the most common in developmental disfluency is that repetition, that mummy. If you're getting prolongations and blocking, that's a little bit more of an indicator that potentially they may continue to have a long-term stammer. It's usually really hugely comorbid with family members having a stammer as well. If a family member has a stammer, then you are more likely to have a stammer yourself. So for most children, stammering will be temporary. Their stammer may stop naturally or following support, but some children continue into adulthood. At the minute, we can't tell, apart from potentially that kind of familial aspect, we can't tend to tell who's going to continue. So it's usually important that we start to support those children. And it isn't about supporting them to stop stammering. It's about them understanding that it's okay to stammer and to get their words out, and for us to give them time to stammer and time to get their words out, and they don't feel rushed. So they are the biggest things that we're talking about. It's really shifted, which is really positive over the last even 10 years. The focus used to be in speech therapy for stammering, used to be on stopping the stammer. But now it's very much on supporting the environment to make sure that it's okay to stammer. So that's what I've given you information on really. It's that giving them time to talk. Avoid finishing their sentences unless they like you to do it. It's really important, that one. I always put that one in, but always do a caveat. Because I would say the vast majority of children that I've worked with who stammer, and I've worked with quite a lot of teenagers who stammer, the vast majority hate it when people finish their sentences because it makes them feel undermined and that their voice is unheard. But I have met 2 or 3 who have said to me, well, when they know what I want to say, they can tell what I want to say, and they're just letting me struggle. Why don't they just do it? So ask them, do you want me to finish your sentences when you're stammering, or would you like me to wait? I'm happy to wait. Maintain eye contact. That's a really important thing. Don't look away when somebody is stammering because it'll make them think that they're doing something that's bad. You want them to maintain eye contact if they are comfortable with it. Don't tell them to take a deep breath. That sometimes starts them again and they will stammer again. This is a big one. So I would talk to the person who stammers if they are comfortable talking about it. Ask them, do you want me to put you on the spot in a class? Do you want me to call on you if you haven't put your hand up? Or shall I wait for you to put your hand up and I know that you're ready to talk? Often children that I've spoken to, especially teenagers, say, I hate it because I put my hand up and I've prepared an answer and then they don't call on me. And then the next time when it's another question and I'm not ready, they call on me for a question and I was ready with my other one. So it's just things like that, having that little conversation with them and saying, oh yeah, so, but you need to make sure you do put your hand up because, you're not getting away with it. But just trying to call on them when they're ready. Some really like to read out in class, some don't. Just talk to them. I've known stammerers have leads in school plays, do narration and all of that kind of thing. Don't discount them from doing it. Actually doing having that conversation and them actually having a go at doing things like that would massively increase confidence. I'm sure a lot of you have seen that Education Yorkshire with Mushy and how incredible he was. I think he did loads for advocating for people who stammer as well. Okay, lovely. I've not spent loads of time on social communication and autism because I think looks like you've got some really fantastic training as part of working with Five anyway on autism particularly. So I've mentioned it because it is part of communication, speech language communication needs, but I know that you've got some more specific training on it, so I don't want to cover it in a lot of detail. But obviously, social communication differences can occur as part of developmental language disorder autism and other neurodivergencies. I'm very much a neuroaffirming therapist, and I do work a lot with autistic children and young people and adults. And as we know, people with those neurodivergencies often have differences in those social rules. So knowing how to initiate a conversation, maybe walking away from a conversation in the middle of it when you're not sure it's meant to be finished, that kind of stuff. Using talking about the similar things and their interests quite a lot of the time. Sometimes differences in body language, so being a little bit like that proximity or eye contact or body gestures, those kind of things. Also differences in understanding figurative language and abstract vocabulary as well. So not understanding sayings and idioms, understanding jokes. Again, as before we were talking about DLD, this can massively impact on mental health, behaviour and school attendance. Sure, you're usually aware of that. That there's much more of a population who have a neurodivergence that potentially might be have school anxiety and not wanting to come to school. So we do talk about, making sure that we are neuro-affirming in our practice, but it's really important, I think, that we talk to the children that we are working with, if they are able, to say, these are the neurotypical rules, and kind of say to them, this is why people have, you might have found a little bit of a different reaction. When you did that, did you find that something happened and maybe they were a little bit cross with you? This is probably because you did this. And maybe teaching it a little bit with them, so they understand the differences, using visuals, using role play, modelling those interactions. But I do think we're moving away from talking about what you did was wrong. It's very much about, we are working on this together, but that's why that happened. Just so they understand it and they're not as confused about what happened and why a conversation went wrong. Teaching them that, when you said this, I think they thought you meant it in a rude way. And because you said that, I think they thought you were being a little bit rude. And that often they're completely shocked by it. Really good example would be, in the speech and language centre that I worked with an amazing, I think at the time she was around 11. So she was year 6, going up to a specialist. We'd got her a place already in a specialist secondary school. She was really lucky, actually. Got an incredible space in a and transition to a specialist secondary school, which are very hard to come by. And she'd been with us for around 4 years. And she was really safe in our lovely little classroom. We understood her really well, and she did have social communication differences. She was very familiar with a lot of people, shall we say, didn't quite understand the social rules, and she got told off by our lunchtime supervisor for not being in the right place in a queue. And she thought she was being really lovely, and she wanted to kind of argue the point that she didn't know what she was doing, and she said, no, 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 girlfriend, and then got absolutely told off for this. And she did not understand why she'd been told off for this at all, because she hadn't understood those differences between, you would say that to your friend, but maybe not somebody in power, or who just not knowing. So there's lots of miscommunication, lots of ways that children with social communication differences can be seen as rude and seen as not complying. So we are obviously very neuroaffirming, as I say, to embrace differences and the autonomy of the child. So as they get older, actually giving them the choice of what they want to work on. I would say the same thing for stammering as well. I've often had conversations with parents of stammerers and autistic children, and when parents potentially wanted to they've still got their head around fixing the autism, fixing a stammer, and talking about the autonomy of that child and young person, that it is their choice of what they want to work on and where they want the therapy to go, and they often make their own aims and targets for therapy. Okay, so obviously implications for practice across the whole lot of speech language communication needs, all school staff. And I would honestly say I've worked with some incredible teachers and incredible TAs and fantastic Senkos and heads, and not to dismiss teachers, Senkos and heads, but I'll be honest, I have mainly worked with TAs in classrooms, and I don't think they would have got the support. A lot of the children, when I was sending them back into schools for the transition, wouldn't have got the support without those incredible TAs. So all school staff play a role in identifying and supporting SLCN. There is some really good stuff out there on creating communication friendly classrooms. So how we do that with visuals, those clear instructions, those repetitions, explicitly teaching vocabulary, and that avoiding sensory overload. Because if a child is overloaded with their auditory and their visual and their proprioception, they're not going to take on any language at all. Definitely collaboration with speech and language therapists and the special educational needs teams that you're working with. And when you're thinking about tracking and monitoring kind of progress in different areas, think about language, not just literacy. So why is there a blockage on their literacy? Could it be the fact that they're not getting this in terms of their language skills? Do they not have the vocabulary to move that literacy skills on anymore? Could it be language? That's the biggest thing I want to get away from. So I'm going to come out of here, if you don't mind, and I'm going to go back in and I'm going to share my other bits of my screen, because I've got some of these things open. So on the thing, I'll go back in and I'll show you what I've outlined for you. Let me get it up. Sorry. I'm going to start with that one. Okay. So share. Sorry, just give me a second. Okay. So shared a book with you that's coming out very soon. This is coming out and it's across the age span. Developing speech language communication skills in education, what works and why. And it's basically going through a lot of the stuff that I've gone through, but in a lot more detail. I'm not making any money from this at all. As you can see, I'm not an editor. I've written 3 of the chapters, co-written 3 of the chapters, but I don't make any money from this. So there's my disclaimer. But I actually think that's going to be a really useful book for people. And then this is a free thing. So the developmental language disorder, this is fab. It's a 44-page document by ICANN. And it's for every teacher supporting children with young people with developmental language disorder. It says mainstream schools, but I think it's useful for all different provisions. It talks about what DLD is. It's got those infographics on and what they should be doing. This is the link to the word aware stuff that I've highlighted as well, which I think is really helpful about teaching vocabulary across the stages. The new one is coming out for secondary as well, just to let you know. There's also something called language for behaviour and emotions, which is fantastic as well. This is the free website to get those print-offs for those phonemes. There's some lovely, I did the treehouse one, but if you prefer flowers, you can use flowers in your classroom if you like that, or planets. But that's got when they should be using those different phonemes. The big one I wanted to go through is this Newcastle assessment of phonological awareness. As you can see, it kind of tells you exactly what this is for and when it was made, and you can download it. And it's a free download for the Newcastle intervention and the Newcastle assessment of phonological awareness, and it's got incredible training videos. So you could use this as a little training in your school, or if you think this is something you really want to focus on, it tells you exactly how to do them and how to integrate it, and it's got some stimulus pictures for those resources as well. So all completely free. All they ask for you to do, which is why I haven't sent these to you, is that you just fill in your name and address so they know where they're going. That's all she asks. So I think she's really trying to put together a little bit more research and see how widely it's being used. So that's all it's asking. That's why I haven't released it for you, because I think it's important that she gets that. Let me just share this screen again, and then I think we are nearly ready for the bits. So I've shared, that's the book that I've shared with you. That's the DLD guide that I've shared with you. That's the word aware. There's also that Vocabulary Ninja website that gets all that lovely the vocabulary stuff and the curriculum based stuff on vocab. I've linked to Twinkle there for colourful semantics. There's some lovely free stuff for all different stages on colourful semantics that you can use to help teach sentence structures and vocabulary. That's the website on shape coding. Again, Twinkle have really gone to town on the blanks stuff. They've got some fantastic resources on those blanks levels, at blanks level 1, 2, 3, 4. Teaches you how to use those, and some fantastic age appropriate resources. I think that's what they're really good at there. Age appropriate resources for teenagers for this as well. It's got like photographs rather than cartoons and things on there as well. Okay, another page, sorry. The speech sound acquisition poster, so there's your link for that. There's your link for your nipper and your napper, which is your phonological awareness. I've also linked in with a couple of things around stammering. So if you wanted to share anything with members of staff in your school around stammering, what it is, how you work with people who stammer, that's a really useful website. That's Stammer website. They used to be the British Stammering Association, and they've changed their kind of branding very much more about people who stammer rather than people who work with stammering, and it's absolutely fantastic. I'm sure a lot of you use Lego therapy, but if you don't, there's some really good stuff on Lego therapy, which helps children with social communication difficulties. But I've also used Lego therapy very successfully, and I love it. I honestly think it's one of the best things ever for children with language disorder as well, because it really helps them be very specific about their vocab and ask questions, and that communication is really useful. I've also put in some things around augmentative communication. So rather than using things like PECs, there's some other things around pod communication boards and things like that as well. So that's, I think, pretty much my presentation. This is me, so I can send references. If anybody wants to hear a little bit more about those percentages, those prevalence rates, anything like that, I've honestly got those to hand. I can send you that. If you have any questions about the content after this, please send me an email. I really don't mind answering any questions or helping anybody out with anything speech language communication needs wise. I'm also on X still a bit, not much. I'm trying to I'm moving across to Blue Sky, but that's my social media stuff, and I do post, they are work ones. I post speech language communication stuff, a lot of speech sound stuff, to be honest, and childhood practice of speech, and trying to get speech therapy and funding for speech therapy, which I think is really important, because I know how high and dry schools are left without support for speech and language. And I do have a YouTube video, which is a YouTube channel, which is mainly for newly qualified speech therapists and student speech therapists, but I don't know if you'd find that helpful as well.